Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Program Officer in the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great research being done by folks who have used the historical collections in the Hagley Library, especially folks who have received support in the form of grants and fellowships from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joining me today is Benjamin Kletzer, PhD candidate in modern Chinese history at the University of California, San Diego, and we'll be discussing his dissertation project titled China's Dream of a Red Railway, Professional Railroaders and the Making of Industrial Power, 1945 to 1976. Ben, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. Now, let's sort of start by painting with broad strokes. What is it that you're researching and writing about?
So my research traces the development of China's railway system, which goes under the name of China National Railways from 1945 to 1976. In the era for the first 4 years under the Civil War, and then the majority of the time under the People's Republic of China leadership. And so this is the era of state socialism in the People's Republic and the formation of a national infrastructure system in a country that until 1949 really lacked railroad access. And by the end of the period, by 1976, has a developed railway network equivalent to other industrialized nations.
What attracted you to railroads in particular as a subject for your research?
So actually, I'm a railway enthusiast, and I started this journey about 15 years ago when I was in high school, and I discovered that China still ran steam locomotives in regular service. It was one of the last places in the world at the time to still have steam trains running. And I saved up money throughout high school, working for a steam railroad, actually, and went to China and found this nation that was just opening up, really. I landed during the closing ceremony of the Olympics in 2008. And so I found this nation that was really opening up to the world at the time and just welcoming an incredible culture, incredibly friendly people, and a fascinating railway system. And I knew nothing of the history of the railways or really of modern Chinese history at the time. And so I came back and promptly started my undergraduate degree with the decision that I would go back to China. And so I started right away taking Chinese language classes and eventually moved back to China to study abroad. And at the time, I was I had focused on Soviet railway history in my undergraduate degree. And upon graduating and living in China for several years as an English teacher, my focus really narrowed from Soviet history to modern Chinese history, and taking a lot of my background knowledge from my undergraduate degree, but also the Chinese language fluency I'd gained through about 5 years of living in the country over time. And so I wanted to get a PhD in history, and that moved from Soviet studies to Chinese studies. And so I started at the University of California at San Diego in 2017. And my dissertation project really developed at the time as it became harder to get access to sources in China. The connections I built through my railway enthusiast hobby became more and more valuable for research, because I built this whole network of friends, acquaintances, contacts in management, even on local railroads in China. And it became clear as research access became harder and harder in China, and this was even before COVID, that those contacts would be crucial. And so my dissertation project really moved towards focusing on China National Railways, which is a topic that's been neglected there's actually only one, unlike right in American history, and especially at the Hagley, railroads are seen as this integral part of political, economic, social, labor histories, history of technology, right? Like this is an integral part of American history in all spaces. But in Chinese history, they've been neglected. The only book actually out is Railroads and the Transformation of China by Professor Elizabeth Cole of Notre Dame, who's I'm honored that she's on my dissertation committee as well. And she has been quite helpful in this project. And that book just came out while I was about 4 years ago. So having seen the lack of scholarship in this field, I really endeavored to write a history that fills in this huge gap and restores understanding of what is the biggest employer, the biggest non-military employer in the world.
Wow.
Right. So China National Railways currently employs 2 million people directly. And that puts it as one of the biggest employers of the world and the biggest non-military employer.
Wow. Well, I think for a lot of our listeners, they might be quite familiar with American railroad history, as you mentioned. So perhaps you could use that as a touchstone. And so how does Chinese railroad history compare and contrast, perhaps, with the American story?
So actually, that's what drew me to the Hagley. And as my time at the Hagley, I've drawn even further parallels, which is that there was a group of Chinese engineers who studied at the Pennsylvania Railroad and effectively brought a lot of the models of the Pennsylvania Railroad to China. And so while it doesn't look like a standard American railroad history, a lot of the particulars actually look like a specific American railroad, which happened to be the biggest railroad in America. Unlike America, though, China's railways grew up before this before independence, right, as a product of colonialism. And so railway imperialism, which is a term that has come and went into acceptance over the years, but really defined railway networks in China. And each colonial power built a railway network in their own sphere of influence to solidify their control and expand their control. And the railways, especially in Manchuria, were the opening salvo of imperialism, right? The railroad was built first and then used to justify imperial conquest. But this created a very disparate network. And unlike the United States, where this was a disparate network of different companies, this was a disparate network of railroads that could not interchange, right? There was a British railroad built to a certain track gauge, and there was a French railroad built in a different country to a much smaller track gauge, no connectivity. In Beijing, for example, there were 4 train stations and no connections in between them.
Oh my.
So freight until 1945, freight actually had to be physically transloaded between stations because freight cars couldn't move between. And had they been able to, they couldn't have actually gone through each other's tunnels because there was no unified clearance even. And so the railroads are really unified. The nationalist government attempts to unify the railroads under this developing Chinese railroad group of Chinese railroad engineers in the 1920s. And it's only stymied by the fact that the nationalist government still follows the debt rules of prior colonial regimes. So the nationalist government is wary to nationalize British and American property because those are allies of the nationalist government and they don't want to alienate their allies. And nationalizations eventually accomplished at horrific loan expense, which the nationalist government bears instead, and then prevents them from making any construction, right? Because they have this huge debt.
Mm-hmm.
And so unlike the United States, right, you don't have this era of maturity of railroads, where in the around 1900 till 1930, till the Great Depression, American railroads really grow into these huge corporations involved in multiple aspects of the economy, because not only have they become profitable enterprises, but they've also become, the linchpin of the economy in each area that they serve, or in multiple areas with the big railroads. China, that doesn't happen. So there's none of that modernization. There's none of that integration. And what happens instead is that you have basically stagnation. And that stagnation is exacerbated then by the Civil War and the Japanese invasion in World War II, which destroys about 90% of the railway network.
Oh, wow.
So
in terms of the rails or the rolling stock or everything?
Rails, rolling stock. So the only intact railroads, which until 1945 aren't part of the Republic of China, are in Manchuria, in what the Japanese have now claimed as their puppet state of Manchukuo. And the nationalist government and its successor, the People's Republic of China, are faced with this very divided, destroyed railway system in 1945. And so this is where it really differs from modern American railroad history. Modern American railroad history, in a lot of ways, is the story of these corporations, especially in the Northeast, burdened by the infrastructure and the expenses of a prior industrial economy, right? And that this later causes these horrific bankruptcies across the Northeast, which leads to Conrail and eventually leads to, of course, all the records being at the Hagley. But China, there's this really restarting point where the same engineers and managers, right, the same brain trust who has been thinking about this for 10, 15, 20 years and growing, because, of course, there's universities, there's study abroad programs with America, there's internships with American railroads, now has a moment where they can rebuild the entire system. And not only can they do this, but of course it's necessary, right? There are no railroads really running. And of course, railroads are the linchpin of any industrialized, modern nation. So that's where it really differs from American history, is that you have this really divisive background and a history that involves American banks, not really American railroads, but American banks. And then in 1945, it basically hits a reset button. And that's then when it starts mirroring the Pennsylvania Railroad and this one particular American railroad, which is known for following a very technocratic, meritocratic leadership model, which in 1945 was starting to lose steam, actually, in the post-war economy, really then comes into China, and that vision of a railroad run by a technocracy, and where decisions are made with engineering first, right? Profitability comes with efficient engineering decisions. Not profitability is the motivator for decisions, and then that influences efficiency in engineering. And so that ends up influencing Chinese railway development to the point where, to this day, if you look at quite a lot of the expenses of China's railways, they look, what they're spending money on, of course, is very different. But the way they allocate money and spend money still looks very much like the Pennsylvania Railroad at its height in the 1910s and 1920s. And that's not because they're copy pasting from 1920. It's because this what I think is this fundamental idea of a technocracy governing this has, of course, imprinted so solidly that it continues to make decisions.
Yeah. Was state ownership of the railroad, did that facilitate the establishment and continuance of this technocracy?
Yes. And so my dissertation actually traces, right, to tell the story of Chinese railway development. My dissertation takes the perspective of the railway technocracy and traces their work, their skill, and their development through this era. And what my dissertation largely shows is that this is a ebb and flow process under the Mao era. And most of that has to do with that the technocracy, even to this day, is uncomfortably independent of the Chinese Communist Party, right? The Chinese Communist Party, of course, contrary to, American political discourse right now about the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party is a very small majority of China, right? Like there's a tiny, far less than 10% of the population is a member of the Communist Party. And that certainly is the case on the railroads, right? Like that 10% of the population is concentrated in political power. So if you look at engineers and managers, right, in any industry, the vast majority of them are not members of the Communist Party. Their power is purely professional technocratic power, right? And they're empowered by the leading political authorities who, of course, give them funding and support and prioritization. But this technocracy is uncomfortably independent for the Communist Party at times. And so in the first era, right, the first kind of, I divide this into eras that follow the general divisions of eras in Chinese history. So just a quick summary, 1949 till 1952 in Chinese history is considered about the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The party now defines it as a new democracy, or this era where they're basically consolidating power. In 1953 to 1957, what's the first 5-year plan? Okay, and so that's a Soviet-style 5-year plan, rapid industrialization. 58 till 61 or 62, depending on how one defines it, is the Great Leap Forward, right? Which is this era that has a completely different economic model, and the resulting famine ultimately killed 30 to 45 million Chinese people, right? So this is horrific. The world's worst man-made famine in human history. After that, there's a recovery period from 62 to 66. And then from 66 to 76, when Mao Zedong dies, is what's considered the greater 10 years of the Cultural Revolution, which is, again, another point where political discourse really radically changes and the country goes through some real horrific humanitarian and political economic disasters. Then to fast forward past my dissertation, right, you have about 2 years of political infighting, and then 78 till 1992 is the era of Deng Xiaoping, and that's the era of reform. In 1992, Jiang Zemin becomes president, and you have the beginning of the first of the 10-year terms of Chinese presidents, which, of course, lasts till this year, when Xi Jinping has now been elected for another term, breaking the precedent of 10-year terms. But and bringing us to the modern day.
Mm-hmm.
My dissertation, at least in the Mao era, is divided into those temporal frameworks because that's what's familiar to readers, and it's familiar to readers because it is I would argue, the most logical way to divide Chinese history to really understand politics, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at my history is a political economic history. If you're looking at a social or cultural history, of course, you divide it through different timelines because, of course, social and cultural trends are dependent on different factors at times,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway,
so how does this periodization map onto the development of the railroad?
So that periodization, yes, thank you. That periodization then goes to basically that rebuilding and consolidation process from 1945 to 1952 on the railroads is a process of unification, connection, consolidation, standardization. The railway technocracy, who actually, the reason I start my dissertation in 45 is because a lot of this starts in 1945 when the CCP first starts controlling railroads. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of sets the stage in Manchuria and spreads south. And as it spreads south, incorporates the existing railroad engineers of those regions because they don't flee to Taiwan. They join their compatriots working for another regime on railroads. Like everyone else did in China, right? So that it's really the technocrats are in charge. There's a military general at the very top, but they're really making decisions on every level to unify, standardize, and create a single railway system. In the first 5-year plan from 53 to 57, then those technocrats take what they built and turn it into a technically advanced railway system. So they using tremendous investments. 21% of the entire budget of the first 5-year plan goes just to the railroads.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
There is more money allocated to locomotive construction than any form of agriculture in the first 5-year plan. Like, this is a tremendous priority. And the result, right, with all that money and all that prioritization comes this rapid growth, right? And so the railroads are able to keep pace with the rapid growth of the economy so that, of course, as rapid heavy industrialization sweeps across the country, the railroads are able to facilitate that. And really, there's no capacity, or a term that we're now very familiar with, right? There's no supply chain shortages, right? That of course, railroads are a huge part of.
Mm-hmm.
And if a railroad is below in capacity, supply chain shortages, of course, result. So that all then, coming into 1957, you have this fairly structured technocracy that's now really a key part of the economy. But like other economic sectors, it is not fulfilling the ideological goals of the Communist Party. And so in the Great Leap Forward, the railroads are radically restructured, stripping away the power of the technocracy and giving all of that power to political leadership. Because the technocracy and the continued existence of the technocracy, of course, defies the egalitarian and revolutionary ideology of Maoism. Right? That there's this expert core of elite managers and engineers who largely come from the working class on the railroads. Okay, they're not wealthy corporate bureaucrats, but this power independent of the party, of course, is really strict, is really questionable to the party, And so you have a politicization of all industrialization, all economic activity, especially the railroads. And in the Great Leap Forward, on the railroads, this creates an environment of horrific train crashes, right? So they strip away rules and regulations are seen as conservative, right? And that if volunteerism guides us, if willpower can guide railway management versus rules and regulations, then that should be followed. And so, of course, when you eliminate rules and regulations, the result is in 3 years, there are 1,378 major train wrecks.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Serious.
Major train wrecks with fatalities. And so in 1960, the party, seeing this, of course, destruction of the railroads, really reverses course, puts the technocracy back in charge. And so the technocracy then goes and basically rebuilds the railways because they've been literally destroyed by political leadership. And in 1966, that rebuilding process is changed by the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution targets intellectuals and people who are not seen as loyal to Mao and the party. And intellectuals and technocrats are a particular target. And so in some areas of the railroads, they're very protected. But what you see on the railroads is that there's a purge of people whose positions are very vulnerable. But you have a transition where the technocracy actually then entrenches itself. And you have technocrats coming out of this, the technocrats, the engineers and managers who have been educated since 1949, all have the party ideology too, because they've been educated since 1949. And so while their elder professors might be targeted for ties to the previous regime, they have the quote unquote red credentials to stay, and they have the technocratic mindset of their professors. And so by the end of the Mao era, what you have is you have a group of people who are tried and true technocrats, right? This is their political, it is, technocracy is politics, but their belief is in science and engineering as management guidelines. That are in charge of the railroads and really power the railroads through economic reform. And to this day, right, where you see a railway network that's really been developed by these technocrats who are, of course, products of the communist education system, but have the professional ethics and priorities of their predecessors who acquired some of these ideas from the Pennsylvania Railroad in Altoona, Pennsylvania.
And so is that the Red Railroad of your title?
Yes. So the dream of the Red Railway is this party's unfulfilled dream of a railway that would be truly revolutionary, right? A railway that would not be hierarchical, that would be governed by volunteerism, that would be governed by the party, that and like in numerous other sectors, the party never achieved this, right? Workers' control in factories and workers' decision-making was ultimately subverted by hierarchical management, right? That, like the rest of the world, right? So if you go to a Chinese factory today, it doesn't look like a communist, whatever Mao thought a communist factory should look like with cooperation and volunteerism. It looks like a factory just like in the United States, but with, of course, a different cultural background. And so that's where the dream of the Red Railway comes from, right? Is that the party dreamed of creating a railway system that would be the standard bearer of a new political reality, a new like the Soviet Union, this utopian vision of a truly communist nation. And what they got instead was a state railway system that looks like every other state railway system around the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you know, has more in common with all the various state railways around the world, and
Mm-hmm.
certain parts of it have a lot in common with Amtrak and Conrail and other national creations in the United States
Mm-hmm.
with railroading than they do, of course, with some utopian communist vision.
Mm-hmm. Which, of course, is really a pretty good stand-in for the political philosophy ruling contemporary China, which is to say, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Of course, that's the phrase, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Of course, those Chinese characteristics seem to be, it's a euphemism for capitalism. So a hybrid system they found to work best.
Yes, and others have argued, right, that there really is, China is a technocratic nation. I that argument, I think, has faded to the background with the Xi Jinping administration.
Mm-hmm.
Xi Jinping, well, a trained engineer, well, right, has of course really pushed back against the technocracy and reasserted the party in everything,
mm-hmm.
every aspect of life.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, right, there's this element that they, like the Soviet Union, like the later Soviet Union, created a you know, politicized, quote unquote, communist technocratic system that, of course, in China has become a very capitalist economy. You know, it's a capitalist economy led by a communist party.
Right. Now, let's bring this back closer to home. How, during the course of this project, did Hagley come onto your radar? And how have you been able to use the collections at the Hagley Library to tell this story?
So I came across the Hagley first. I was in the Baltimore and Ohio Railway archives in Baltimore, in the Baltimore and Ohio Railway Museum. And I came across references to a group of engineers and technicians who were in the United States during World War II. And these were all names that I knew from my Chinese history research, because these were all major decision makers in China. But it referred to them as this group, the Association of Chinese Railway Technicians in America. And this group was in the United States with U.S. War Department funding to help to study American railroads so that they could rebuild Chinese railroads in the aftermath of World War II. And the biggest group was at the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so I applied for an exploratory grant with the Hagley just to look in the Pennsylvania Railway archives, because, of course, the Hagley has the largest collection of departmental records. Well, the Pennsylvania State Archives have the presidential correspondence. The Hagley's archives, focusing on every vice president and especially the departments, actually show how the Pennsylvania Railroad worked, right? These are really essential records for understanding the railroad. And of course, individual interns from China don't meet with the president. They go to the department that they're going to work in. And you see that in those department files. And so at the Hagley, I discovered a wealth of this information. And it turns out that the PRR files are filled with references to links to China, between sharing motive power data, selling locomotives, and most of all, right, these foreign exchanges with this group of engineers who were working throughout the PRR system. And so through the exploratory grant, I, tested the waters and found all these files. and then applied for a Henry Bellin DuPont research grant to come back to then do really in-depth research with the PRR archives to understand not just what this group of engineers was doing, but what technology, what ideas, what they were exposed to, and what came back to China, right? What was the actual technology transfer? What was the actual knowledge transfer? And the Hagley files show all of that. I mean, it's incredible.
That's wonderful.
Because they from looking at the blueprints that the Chinese engineers helped draw, which the Hagley has, you can see individual technologies like brake shoes, axles, axle boxes that come to China with these engineers that are standard Pennsylvania Railroad designs, but now, of course, become the standard designs in the People's Republic of China through these students. And so the Hagley archives have been crucial to this.
That's just terribly exciting. It sounds like you struck gold, as it were.
Yes, I mean, I truly did. The Pennsylvania Railway archive at the Hagley, would take years to go through, of course, every file of it. It's huge. But the areas that my research touches are huge amounts of the files, and I was able to find a tremendous amount. I mean, like, really, and it really solidified understanding the realities of technology transfer, but also the realities of this knowledge transfer from this famously technocratic, meritocratic railroad to building a now technocratic railroad.
I love hearing that, because at the Hagley Center, we just live to facilitate folks' research and use of the Hagley collections, and it's just great to see what comes out the other side. Now, Ben, does your research have any implications for the present day? I think particularly about concerns about, well, specifically technology transfers, sometimes illicit and sometimes licit, above or below the board, between the United States and China. Perhaps your work might speak to the present moment in some way.
Yeah, so my work, I've done two things. To talk specifically about technology transfer, we can see how Chinese railways are really in touch with the world technological developments, but also are quite capable of their own innovations, right? That Chinese technology on the railways is not dependent on copyright violation, industrial espionage, but instead really is taking ideas that may be foreign or may be domestic and applying them to Chinese railways. There is, in certain spheres, especially with high-speed rail, there are legitimate accusations of stealing specific Japanese technologies. Those are now past tense, actually, because China has now developed their own technologies based on the pilfered technologies that are used in their current generations of high-speed trains. But those are legitimate. So I think my research shows being wary of broad strokes about intellectual copyright violation, because on Chinese railways, oftentimes what you find is, well, you could look at this and say, yeah, they stole that, right? That's reverse engineered. In reality, it's a similar but independently developed way to solve similar problems. And to be blunt, like at this point with Chinese railway development, they're leading the pack, not following the pack. And
Mhm.
so there was very few people to steal from anymore in the outside world because especially, right, the United States, we're now with freight railroads, still ahead of China in terms of raw tonnage, but technological development, we're 50 to 60 years now behind China.
Mhm.
And it's that we've been stagnant for 50 and 60 years and China hasn't.
Mhm.
And so what you have is it's really a nuanced view of technology transfer, right?
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
saying it's copying, saying it's reverse engineered is too much of a blanket statement, right? That there's instead there are ideas borrowed, there are ideas shared, but there are also ideas that are purely national innovations, right? That are products of this group of technocrats who now have existed in Chinese history for well over 80 years and in the People's Republic of China for the entirety of the People's Republic of China. And of course, have a multitude of research institutions, a multitude of universities, right? They have funding for railway development that dwarfs anything in the United States. So with that sort of research and development, of course, you're going to have your own innovations that cannot be called stealing from the outside world. Um, one of the big things I really focus on in presenting my research in a popular sphere
Mhm.
is really the similarities between Chinese railroads and Western railroads as a way we've seen in recent years, right, a rise in the demonization of China.
Mhm.
When that there's a bleed over in the United States between demonizing the Communist Party of China and
Mhm.
the Chinese population.
Mhm.
And my research really pushes back against this, showing that not only is this formerly state enterprise, okay, it's in an ambiguous sphere since 2013, but it's effectively a state enterprise. Not only does the state enterprise look like every other state railway, including capitalist Germany, Amtrak, all the state railroads of the world,
Mhm.
but it looks like public or private corporations as well, right? Like the Pennsylvania Railroad of old or Union Pacific of today, right? And that these railroad workers, right, the technocrats and workers alike, are doing the same jobs as American railroaders, American engineers, American workers.
Mhm.
And that while, there are political disputes, there's this unifying idea behind work, labor history, history of technology, the sociology of labor groups that should unify people and push back against the demonization of a group of people, right? Which is unfortunately more and more common,
Mhm.
especially as I have conversations in the public sphere. The question always is when is China going to take over the United States,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And of course, no. The answer is just no, it's not going to happen.
Mhm.
Right? But that instead that we should think about what's really shared between us and China as the Chinese railroaders who are doing the same job as a railroader,
Mhm.
down the road in Wilmington, switching freight cars around right now, getting ready to go to work,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. I like that image. We're all riding the same train.
Yes. And of course, with a railroad dissertation, the puns and the metaphors come very quickly and work their way into chapter titles. But the reality, right, is that this really is, we need, we're unified, right? We're
Hmm.
riding the same train.
Hmm.
We're unified by our work and of course our citizenship on this planet, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, Ben, I just love this project and it's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm
Oh,
very honored.
you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts or more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org, that's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.